In phase 2 of this 3-part project, we're going to code our 3 main pages here for home, in which we're going to display some information about JSON, a little sample JSON file, and the fact we're also going to use ChatGPT and the community, the MAUI Community Toolkit and Mopups NuGet. We'll also code out the data page, which will have a collection view to show all the records that have been inputted. In phase 3, we'll allow the user to select an image and view the details, update it, or remove it. But in this phase, we will create an add page that will allow the user to add records into our JSON data and into the data list. We'll also have the ability to copy the existing JSON so that we could export it to an email or to a text file. Let's jump over to Visual Studio and continue our project. In this phase, we're going to start with the home.xaml page, and we have a vertical stack layout for the label that was part of the template when we created this new page. I'm going to delete that, and through the magic of video, so you have to watch me type it in. There is the code. Let me walk you through it. We have a vertical stack layout. I set the spacing, the padding, and the vertical options to start. I want this to be at the top. We're going to have a label that simply says JSON Demo. I sent the font information for that, gave it a little bit of margin at the top just to bring it down a little bit from the top of the page, and then did a label called LBL About. And I'm going to set the text just to the word About. We're going to change the text programmatically in the underlying C# code behind. Then I created a frame and gave it a border and a background color of IE, gave it a little padding, corner radius, make it rounded, and did a vertical stack layout inside of that of 2 labels. One that simply says sample JSON data, and the other one is a label named LBL example, and set the text to example. And again, we're going to modify that text programmatically when the page loads from the code behind. Below that, I did another frame, and this one simply says that we're going to be using ChatGPT. Did a label that says this project demonstrates how to generate text info with ChatGPT API. And then another label says MAUI Community Toolkit, got a little spelling error there, Toolkit and Mopups NuGet, and there's some information that we'll use both Community Toolkit and Mopups NuGet package to display custom dialogues. Made those font sizes micro, so they fit on the page really well. The title's a little bit larger, and that's our home.xaml code. Let's go into the home.xaml CS. Earlier, we had added the public static int next rec ID, so our person class would recognize that variable. But we need to add some more things here. I'm going to add a couple directives at the top. So the first one is a directive referencing the models folder with our namespace. So whatever your namespace is for your project, however you named it, make sure you change that to whatever it is, .models, and then we're going to use newtonsoft.json. In the zip file that I provided you, there's a text file that has a little bit of text in it, and that's these 2 items for the text of string about and string example. In the string example, I used a lot of new line items and tab items, so it's a little bit confusing. I thought it would be easier for you to copy and paste that in rather than have to recreate that. So go ahead and paste those in. I'm going to add some more variables. I'll do it up here with my next rec ID. And that's going to be our list, our generic list of type person, which we're going to call it people. And so it's going to equal a new list of type person. We're going to have a string called data path, which is going to be set to the file system.app directory, a string called file name, and we're going to name our file mydata.json. You can name anything you like. Another string called full path that will be the data path and the file name combined. And then also a string that represents our JSON data. That's going to be the serialized JSON code with the array of objects for each of our records. Those are all set to public static so we can reference them in other pages. We're going to modify the constructor for the home page, which will reference that next rec ID as being from the preferences.default, and we're going to get that next record ID, and if it doesn't exist, we're going to set it to 0. So that's going to create that data item in our preferences. Then we're going to create our full path by combining the data path and the file name. And then we'll set the lbl_about.text to our about variable and do the same with the lbl_example.text, setting it to our example variable. And then we'll conclude by checking to see if the file exists of our JSON data in the application directory using that full path. If it does exist, we're going to call a method we're going to create here in just a second for the retrieve JSON and send it the full path. That's going to allow us to take the JSON data and create a list of objects in that list called people we created above. If it doesn't exist, we're going to call a method called showAlert and pass it no data as our title and no data currently exists, add some records as our prompt. I created a method to do this because I didn't want to make and I'm not sure I even can, make the public home an async method, that constructor an async method. So I'm going to call a method that will be async and pass it the information it needs. Let's go ahead and create that and our retrieve JSON methods. For our showAlert, it's going to be async method of type void. It's going to be passed a title and a prompt. So up here, our no data is the title, the no data currently exists is our prompt. We're going to set an await task to delay just a little bit in case there's any latency. I've noticed some latency in the Android emulator, so we'll pause a half a second. And then we're going to call our display alert method with our title prompt and the OK button. For our retrieve JSON, we're setting it a path. So I have a string myPath as our parameter. We're going to try reading the file from that myPath, which in our case, we're passing it full path in the name of our JSON file, mydata.json. If the length is greater than 5, and it should be if that file exists, we're going to clear our people list, and then we're going to convert or deserialize our JSON data file into that list of type person, and we're going to pass it the data. That's the data that was read. Then we're going to display an alert saying that the deserialization is complete and how many records there were. I like to know how many records were converted over, so I know the size of my database. And that's a great way of being able to test to make sure that everything's also working. But I think it's good to tell the user how much data there is. If the length is less than 5, the file exists but there's nothing in it, then we're going to say no data currently exists, add some records. In reality, we probably should never encounter that, but it's good to have that as an option. If we have errors in any of that process, we're going to catch it and show the exception of what went wrong. And then finally, I'm going to add one more method here that we'll reference later on, but it's going to be called findIndex. It's a public static method, so I can reference the method from other classes. It's going to return an integer. And what I want to do is I'm going to search for an ID that's passed to it. So each of our records have an automated ID, but the ID doesn't necessarily correspond to the index in our list because we might delete records. So I want to search for the index of that particular ID number. And that's what this method does. So we're going to iterate through our people list. So people.count is our upper bounds here on this for loop. And if people sub I, each record's going to be sub I in our loop. If its ID equals the search ID, we found that record and we can return I. That's going to be the index in our list. Otherwise, we return a -1, meaning it didn't find it. That is our home.xaml.cs. Let's go on to the add records XAML. In the add records XAML, we have our template with just the vertical stack and the label. We're going to replace that, and again, through the magic of video, there is my code. In the content page, we have a scroll view with a vertical layout, spacing of 20, padding of 20 left and right, vertical option set to start, basically the same label I did before as a JSON demo. And then I created a frame that contains a vertical stack layout with a label. It simply says add a person, and then a horizontal stack layout with a label and an entry for them to enter the first name. And we named that entry first name. Another horizontal stack layout with a label and an entry for entry last name as its name. And then a third horizontal stack layout, get the label, this is occupation, and then the entry is named entry occupation. And you can see the attributes that I set each of those to. And then I added a button below those horizontal stack layouts for submitting that record and named it BTN Submit. It's going to call an event called Submit Record. That's our clicked event. End of my vertical stack layout, end of the frame. Then I put a button below the frame that says Copy JSON, and it's going to have a clicked event of Copy JSON, and then a label below that of LBL output. The text is going to say output goes here. And what that label is going to do is as we add new records, it's going to say the record for this person was added, just to give us some feedback. So we need to create events for Copy JSON and Submit Record. Let's go into our C# code behind for add records. First thing I'm going to do is add some directives for our models folder and our new newtonsoft.json NuGet package. Again, set your models directive to use whatever your namespace is. I'm going to change the public partial class add records by adding that submit record event handler and the copy JSON event handler. Let me walk you through those. On the submit record, we're going to set the string of LName and FName and occupation to our entry lastname.text, entry firstname.text, and entry occupation.text. We're going to make sure those are not null. So if any of those are null, then it's going to hit this else, so check your data, something's wrong. We're going to verify they actually entered something in all three of those fields. We're going to take our home.people, that was our list, and we're going to add to it a new person, calling our constructor the person class of LName, FName, and occupation. Those are the values the users have entered that we put in those three strings. We're going to take I as a variable and say it equals home.people.count. So I want to know how many records there are in that list now. We're going to take LBL output.text and say home.people I-1, because remember we start counting with 0, so we're going to subtract 1 to get the most recent record. We're going to get the full name, and we're going to say that was added to the list. This is providing some feedback to our user that it was successful in adding that user to our list collection. Then we're going to empty those three entry views, setting them to null. We're going to set the focus to the top one, which is first name. We're going to update our JSON data file coming from home is where it's defined, our home page. We're going to call JSON convert. That's part of our Newtonsoft JSON. We're going to serialize the objects from our home.people list. That's going to create our JSON data file. So we're rewriting it each time we add a record. Then we're going to write that record out to our application directory using full path by specifying system.io.file.write all text, setting up full path, and what we're going to send it is that home.json data variable. It's a string. We're going to increment our next record ID that's referenced on home. That's in our preferences. So the next time we get the next number for ID, and then we're going to update the preferences to that. And again, if that doesn't work, we'll tell them to check our data. That's only going to happen if one or more of those three entry fields is empty. For our copy JSON, this is so we can export this data from our mobile device, maybe to an email, to maybe a file in the cloud, such as in Google Docs. We're going to set a string called myJSON. We're going to serialize our list into that JSON string, just as we did up here. We're going to set the default clipboard to the set text async of that value of myJSON. That's an asynchronous method. And then also asynchronously, we're going to display the alert that the data was copied. So then the user can go into an email or into Google Drive, get a Google Doc, and paste it in if they want to try to export it. That's our add records. Let's go on to the data list. Again, we have our template. I'm going to delete that. And here then is my code in replacement of it. I'm going to use a grid. I'm going to set the margin to 15 all the way around. We're going to have 3 rows. One's going to be 15%, one's going to be 80%, and the other one's going to be 5%. Row 1, I just want to display some heading information. So I've got the title of data list, and then a horizontal stack layout is going to contain 2 buttons and a label. One button is going to allow us to search our data list for a particular occupation. The other button, the third option there, third item in our horizontal stack layout, will allow us to show all the items in our data. And then the label in between is going to tell us what we're looking at. So the name is going to be LBL now showing, and it's going to start out with showing all records. And then later we can say showing all basketball players or all actors when we use that search button. Row 2 is our collection view. That's our data items being displayed in a scrollable list. We're going to name that CV people, and I want that needs to be named so we can reference later in the code behind what our data source is. This is going to be for grid row 1. That's our second row. That's the 80% one. We're going to set the selection mode to single. They can only choose one item at a time. And then when they click an item, we're going to call a event handler called getDetails. And we'll also make our vertical scroll bar available. Then we're going to set up an item template for that collection view, which will contain a data template. And again, we use another grid with 2 columns. The first column is going to be 15%, the second column is 85%. In that first column, I'm going to display a label called LBL initials. The text I'm going to show is binding of the value of initials. So that initials is a property in our person class. And the binding allows us to connect these two together, to wire that property to the value of the text property. We're going to talk a lot more about binding as we get into MVVM architecture next week. So some controls of that: background, font, information. I want it to basically be a blue background, kind of a square with the initials being shown in white. Then I've got a vertical stack layout on the other column, which I'm going to show the full name of the person. So here again, I'm binding to the full name property of our person class instance. And we're going to bind the second label to the occupation, make that a little bit smaller. So use a smaller font for that one, size 10, and the full name is size 21. Close that vertical stack, close the grid, close the data template and the item template and our collection view. And then finally, I'm going to add an activity indicator. This is going to be a circular animated indicator. When we click on a selector, we're going to go out and show the details pop up. But in that process, we're going to grab a brief bio online from ChatGPT. It's going to take probably about a half to a full second to generate that. We want to make sure our user waits for that. So that activity indicator is going to pop up. We're going to set the is running to false and the is visible to false initially. So don't see it until they click on it. But it's going to give that indicator until that pop-up comes up, and then we'll do away with the indicator. I ended up changing the scale on this. I originally set it to 2.5, which worked great on the iOS. When I ported it over to Android, it was way too big. So in fact, even at the scale at 1, I think is too big here. So I set the Android to 0.5. You can play with those numbers if you like, but I do think the Android, and this should be, got a little mistake here. This should be 1.0, comma, Android equals 0.5 and iOS equals 2.5. Now let's take a look at the code behind for our data list. So we need to create the binding in that code behind in our item source. We need to set up the search button and the show all button for those events, btn search underscore clicked, btn show all underscore clicked, and then also set up when they click the item here for the selection, get details. We need to code all of that. So let's go look at the data list XAML.cs. Once again, I'm going to set up some directives. The first one being a reference to our models, then the Newtonsoft. The Rust sharp is a reference to our NuGet package for going out to a REST API, which in this case is going to be the OpenAI ChatGPT API. And then the Mopups will allow us to create a custom dialog using another content page. Those are all grayed out because right now we don't have code that references, but you will see those come to life as we add in code. We're going to create a couple of variables here at the top that are class level. One's going to be a type person. So our data model, we're going to name it current person. We're going to set it initially to John Doe, and our occupation is going to be Ak. We're going to change that data. When we select an item from the collection view, we're going to change current person to that item, and then we can reference all of its properties very easily. The REST client here is coming from our REST sharp. Notice that it now is no longer grayed out. It's being referenced. And we're going to set a variable called GPT client to a new REST client. Here's the string of where we want to go. After my constructor, I'm going to create a protected override void on navigated to, and our parameter list here is just navigated to events in our variables args. We're going to, since it's being overridden, we need to pass it on to the base of this, and then we're going to call a reference called btn showall.clicked, and we're going to pass it null and null, because this is, remember, this is an event handler where normally it's going to have the sender and the event args. We're going to say ignore those. We don't need those in this particular calling of it. So we need to create that. Let's go on. Here are the events for both clicking the btn search button and the btn show all. Notice that now that little squiggly went away because we now have this referenced. Our search button is going to be asynchronous, and it's going to have a string called result equals await display prompt async. This is like the display alert, but it's a little bit different in that we can have the user enter a string value. So that's going to go into our string named result. So that's built into .NET MAUI. That's not part of our community toolkit or part of the mop-ups. We're going to have a title of search occupations and then a little prompt here that says enter search contains. So we can look for, if we want to look for actor and actress together, we can just type in act. If we want to look for basketball players and baseball players and football players, we can just type in player if we wanted, or maybe type in ball. We're going to use a language integrated query structure here, or link, to search our home.people list. And each one of those we're going to name PPL. As we go through and iterate through that list, we're looking for items where ppl.occupation, we're going to invert it to lower, contains, and the result can convert it to lower. That way there's no case sensitivity here. We're going to order it by ppl.lastname, a space, and the PPL first name. So we're going to alphabetize these by last name first and then first name. And then we're going to select those items. That's all going to go into our variable called ocklist. Then we can set the item source for our collection view named CV people to the awk list. And we're going to change that LBL now showing label, its text property, to say occupation contains and whatever the item was that they entered. Our show all basically works the same way, except we're going to go through our people list and we're going to order it alphabetically and select all of them and set the item source this time to people list. And then our LBL label, LBL now showing label, the text property will be showing all records. Here's my get details event handler, passing it sender as our object. This is a change selection from our collection view. So our argument here is selection changed event args. We're going to try setting that AI wait activity indicator, setting its visibility and its running to true. We're going to delay just 1/10 of a second in case there's any latency here. We're going to set current person to the current selection of first or default. Now that is because we could have set this up to select multiple people. We didn't do that. It's not appropriate in this case. But first or default is a method of what was the item that was selected. And we're going to say as person. In other words, we want to get the person object that is behind that data item. We're going to create a string called GPT prompt of write a paragraph about, and then we're going to add in the occupation, a space, and their full name. And we're going to pass that prompt to another method we're going to call showGPT-dialog along with their full name. This is going to create that pop-up of details, which will be a mop-up, which is why we added the mop-up services up here. What's returned from the ChatGPT prompt is going to be the body text, and then the title will be our full name. If something goes wrong, such as maybe the internet's down, we can't access ChatGPT somewhere along the way, then we're going to get a display alert something went wrong. So now we need to code that show GPT dialog. Here then is our show GPT dialog. We're passing it the prompt and the title. Now let's actually reverse what we normally do with a display alert. So if you want to swap those around, make sure you can do that. Just make sure you swap them around up here where you're passing the prompt and the current person. So we're going to take that prompt and we're going to pass it to send GPT request, another method I'm going to show you in a minute that's going to call our ChatGPT API. And then we're going to change our activity indicator running and visibility to false. We don't need it anymore. We're going to do a delay of 100 milliseconds. So originally I was doing this with a Community Toolkit pop-up, but I wanted to have more pop-ups on top of that. And Community Toolkit won't let us do that, which is why I went to the mop-ups. So a mop-up is, it inherits from ContentPage, so I can add Community Toolkit pop-ups on top of the mop-up, or I could even add more mop-ups on top of the mop-up. So that was just an explanation here of why I switched from Toolkit pop-up to mop-ups. And our await is mopupservices.instant.pushAsync. We're going to push a new person pop-up page, and we're getting a squiggly here because we haven't really defined that page. We haven't defined that it takes a title and a response. So we need to modify that code to allow us to submit a title and response. If something goes wrong, again, we're going to display a message box or an alert that something didn't work. Here's where we're calling the ChatGPT request. I had some resources here that I gotten offline of how to really do this, so those are just reference here. You might want to look at those items. But based on openai.com, there was a article that I read here on using ChatGPT and C#. You might find that helpful. And then a getting started with ChatGPT API, a comprehensive guide that somebody else had written. I found those useful. This is actually really simple to do. So we're going to create a post request to the internet. We're going to create a variable called GPT request. It's going to equal a new REST request. Again, we're using that REST API NuGet package. We're going to have a null string and then the method.post. We're going to set its header to content type applications/JSON. So we're using a JSON object. Our authorization is going to be the bearer, and we're going to reference that OpenAI key that we put in our MAUI program CS. So if you named it something different, change the name here. I used my initials, SFH, OpenAI key. And then let's have some information here on what these different items are that we're sending in this request. We're giving it a prompt, we're giving it max tokens, we're setting the value of N, which is the number of responses. So ChatGPT can give us 3 different paragraphs we could choose from. We don't want to do that here, we just want one. The max tokens is going to help us determine how long that paragraph is on average. And then the stop is used to keep it from generating further responses, and the temperature controls the amount of creativity. So the higher the temperature, the more diverse and creative the output will be. I set it about midway, 0.5. You can play around with the number if you like. GPT request.add JSON body. We're going to serialize that message into a JSON object. Remember, that's what we're setting up here as the content type. It's going to send that request with an execute statement to the server. The response is going to go into a variable called response. Our variable JResponse then is going to equal taking content, response.content, and deserializing it into a string. It's going to return a JSON string back to us. And if that doesn't work, we want an empty string. Then we're going to extract that information from our JSON response. We want element 0, if it exists, that's the question mark there, .text, if that exists, .toString, .trim. And if those don't exist, we'll get an empty string. Now, before we can test this, because we have this one little problem here that person popup is expecting a title and response, let's go into our person popup.xaml.cs. And let's add here our parameters of string. I'm just going to say FN, it's going to be our full name, and our string, I'm just going to use A, which will be our about information, that bile is being returned. I'm not going to code this. We'll do that in phase 3. We'll handle all of our details and updating and removing of records. But now let's go back to our data list. I'm going to go to build and choose clean all. It said the clean was successful. This didn't go away. Can't convert JSON demo person pop-ups to so this is a mop-up page. I need to tell it that this is a mop-up page. So I'm going to replace the content page to mopups.pages.popuppage. So an issue here on my person pop-up that says partial declarations of person pop-up must not specify different base classes. So I need to go into the XAML because this is no longer a content page. This is a Mopups PopupPage. And we also need to add in the Mopups namespace here. So XML namespace colon Mopups equals and we can scroll through the list down to our Mopups. We want our Mopups pages, and that'll put it in there for us. So those squigglies now have all gone away. Let's go back and check our CS page. And that now is all acceptable. Go back to our data list. Everything looks good there. Let's go ahead and test this and see if we're getting the information we can add records. So we get that little dialog that comes up that says no data exists. We haven't created any data. So the my.data.json file is not existent in our application directory. That's okay. It's what we're expecting. We don't have any data being shown here because there's no data that exists at this point. So let's go to the Add Records button. Let's type in a couple names. So I'm going to start with Mickey Mantle and say that Mickey Mantle is a baseball player. I'm going to add James Stewart, actor. Let's add Hank Aaron as a baseball player. Alfred Hitchcock as a director. Notice that has some spell checking built in, so I capitalize the I here. I can just choose director with the lowercase I. Add the record. Let's add in Grace Kelly as an actress. And I'll add in one more baseball player. Let's just do Stan Musial. Baseball player. Okay, so I can click the copy JSON, and I'm told that I copied the JSON to the clipboard. Now I can't paste that into something here on my development machine. I have to go into another item here in the mobile directory because we're running this inside a virtual machine. So I have to go into like maybe the email on this emulator. I'm not going to bother to do that. I'm going to assume that that works. You notice here, as I was adding records, it told me records are being added. Now if I go to the data page, I now see that information. And while I can click on each of these, we haven't really coded that pop-up other than making it to accept the data. So we wouldn't see anything happen there. So, but that all seems to be working. I'm going to go back to the home. I want to do one more thing, and that is I'm going to close my application and rerun it again. And now I'm told there are 6 records that were deserialized from the JSON file into my list. So everything seems to be working quite well at this point. Oh, we didn't test here the searching. Let me do one more thing here. I'm going to click search. Search occupations. Let's just say baseball. I'm going to click OK. And there's my 3 baseball players. If I type in director and I spell it right, I get Alfred Hitchcock. If I search for actor, I get James Stewart. But if I search just for act, I'll get the actors and the actresses. And so I get Grace Kelly and James Stewart. And notice each time everything is alphabetized. If I click show all, I'll get all the records. So that too is working. Let's go on to phase 3 and handle the pop-ups for these, as well as the editing of any of the records or deleting any of the records. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the .NET MAUI Practicum playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos I create,
you can click my picture in the top right to subscribe to the channel.